Before we step into the darkness, do one thing, like this video. It may seem small, but it helps keep these stories alive. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and stay close, because you don't want to face what lurks in the unknown alone. And if you've lived through a real horror, tell your story in the comments. Who knows? It might just resurface here and haunt us all.
My name is James Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I've spent the last 7 years working as a wildlife biologist. My job has taken me to some of the most remote and uncharted places on the planet, places most people wouldn't dare to go. I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who trusts facts and science above all else. But what I'm about to share with you, it defies explanation. This happened in the summer of 2012, deep in the Everglades. I went in expecting to study wildlife. I came out with the kind of memories that still haunt me to this day. I'll never forget the heat. It was the kind of suffocating, sticky heat that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel like a chore. The Everglades were alive that morning, the air buzzing with the hum of cicadas and the distant croaks of bullfrogs. For a biologist like me, it was paradise. A living, breathing ecosystem waiting to be studied. I was preparing for a week-long solo expedition, loading my gear onto a small rental boat at a rundown dock on the edge of the swamp. My goal was to track the elusive ghost heron, bird so rare that some scientists doubted it even existed. The locals' course had plenty of stories about it. Tales of a pale, ethereal bird that appeared only in the deepest, darkest parts of the Everglades. I wasn't here for folklore. I was here for proof. As I secured my last bag, a voice broke through the drone of insects. "You heading out alone?" I turned to see an older man standing a few feet away, his weathered face shadowed under a wide, brimmed hat. He had the look of someone who'd spent his entire life in the swamp, skin like leather, eyes sharp as a gator's. "Yeah," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Why?" The man took a step closer, his boots crunching on the wooden dock. "You planning to go near Blackwater Creek?" The name caught me off guard. It wasn't marked on any official maps, but I'd seen it referenced in a few old reports. Supposedly, it was one of the least explored areas of the Everglades. "Maybe," I said cautiously. "Why?" The man's expression darkened. "You'd do well to stay clear of it. That's skunk ape territory." I couldn't help but laugh. "You're serious, swamp Bigfoot?" His eyes didn't waver. "Laugh all you want, but if you go poking around where you don't belong, you'll find out the hard way." I thanked him for the warning, though I couldn't hide the smirk on my face. I'd heard plenty of tall tales about the skunk ape over the years, a legendary creature rumored to haunt the Everglades. Most people described it as a massive, foul-smelling ape with glowing eyes. It was nothing more than a local ghost story, a way to spook tourists and pass the time. At least, that's what I thought then. The boat ride into the swamp was uneventful at first. The waterways twisted and turned like veins, the mangroves forming natural tunnels that blocked out the sun. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The buzz of insects faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. By midday, I reached a small inlet near Blackwater Creek. I tied the boat to a low hanging branch and set off on foot, my pack heavy with gear and supplies. The air was thick with the smell of mud and decay, a scent I'd grown used to over the years. The trail was faint, little more than a series of flattened reeds and broken branches. I followed it deeper into the swamp, the dense foliage closing in around me. Every so often, I stopped to take notes or adjust the settings on my trail cameras. That's when I found the first strange sign. It was a footprint, massive and humanoid, pressed deep into the mud. The toes were splayed wide, each one tipped with what looked like claw marks. I crouched down, tracing the edges with my gloved hand. No animal I knew of could have made this. I snapped a few photos and kept moving, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached the lagoon where I planned to set up camp, the sun was low in the sky. The water glistened like black glass, perfectly still. I pitched my tent on a small patch of dry ground and started unpacking my equipment. That's when the smell hit me. It was faint at first, a musky, almost rancid odor that made my nose wrinkle. I'd encountered plenty of full smells in the field. Rotting vegetation, dead animals. But this was different. It was sharp and overwhelming, clinging to the air like a warning. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural smell of the swamp. But as I sat by the water, jotting down notes, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. Then came the sound. It started as a faint rustling in the trees, so subtle I almost missed it. But it grew louder, closer. Branches snapped, and the water rippled as if something large had just slipped beneath the surface. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the dense foliage. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees, too fast and too large to be an animal. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing across the lagoon. No response. The rustling stopped, and the swamp fell silent once more. I stood there, frozen, every muscle in my body tense. That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't sleep. The musky odor lingered, and the shadows outside seemed to stretch and shift with every flicker of my lantern. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard a low, guttural growl. I told myself it was my imagination. I was wrong. If you're still listening, then you already know I made a mistake. I should have left that swamp the moment I saw those footprints. I should have turned around and gone back to the dock. But I didn't. I stayed, convincing myself it was all just part of the job. I told myself there was nothing out there I couldn't explain. I was wrong. I woke up just before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. The swamp was eerily quiet, as if the world itself had paused. Even the insects were silent. I sat up in my tent, rubbing the stiffness from my neck, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me during the night. The smell was still there, faint but unmistakable. That same musky, rancid odor that seemed to cling to everything. I stepped outside, the early light filtering through the mangroves in weak, golden streaks. My boots sank into the wet ground as I walked toward the lagoon, scanning the area for any signs of wildlife. But there was nothing. No birds, no frogs, no ripples on the water. It was like the swamp was holding its breath. As I checked my trail cameras, I noticed something strange. One of them, the one I'd set up facing a narrow trail leading deeper into the mangroves, had been knocked over. The strap was torn clean off, and the camera itself was lying face down in the mud. I picked it up, wiping the muck off the lens, and frowned. Something had broken it, but not in the way an animal might. There were no bite marks, no scratches. It was deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I powered the camera back on and scrolled through the photos. Most of them were just empty frames, shots of the trail as the light faded into night. But then I saw it. In one of the last photos, taken just after midnight, there was a shape in the distance. A tall, dark figure standing partially obscured by the mangroves. It was hard to make out any details, but it didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. It was humanoid. My stomach tightened as I stared at the image, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the trees. But deep down, I knew better. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on my research, but the unease never left me. The swamp felt wrong. Every step I took, every movement I made, felt like it was being watched. Around midday, I found another footprint. This one was deeper, more defined, pressed into the mud near a narrow creek. It was the same as the one I'd seen the day before. Massive, humanoid, with clawed toes. And this time, it wasn't alone. There were 3 sets of prints, all heading in the same direction. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone. I followed the tracks for a while, my machete in hand and my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew thicker the deeper I went, the shadows under the mangroves darker. The smell, the same musky, rotting odor, grew stronger, clinging to the back of my throat. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound was deep and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder, but there was something alive about it. Something intelligent. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. The only response was the rustle of leaves and the snap of a branch. I turned slowly, scanning the trees with my flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, but all it revealed were twisted roots and swaying branches. And then I saw it. Just for a moment, no more than a second, a figure moved between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in dark, matted fur. Its movements were quick, almost predatory, and its glowing eyes locked onto mine before it disappeared into the mangroves. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I tried to follow its path, but it was gone. The growl came again, closer this time. I didn't wait. I ran back to my camp, my boots slipping in the mud, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. Every shadow seemed to shift, every branch seemed to reach for me. When I finally reached the tent, I grabbed my pack and started throwing everything into it. I didn't care about the research anymore. I didn't care about the ghost hearing. All I cared about was getting out of that swamp. But as I packed, I heard it again. The growl, now accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. The musky odor was overwhelming now, filling the air like a fog. I grabbed my machete and spun around, my back to the tent. The footsteps stopped, and the swamp fell silent. "Stay back," I whispered, my voice shaking. The shadows moved, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. The skunk ape stepped into the clearing, its massive frame blocking out the light. It stood on two legs, its hunched shoulders brushing the low, hanging branches. Its fur was dark and matted, and its eyes burned like embers in the shadows. It tilted its head, studying me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then it took a step forward. "If you've made it this far, I need you to understand something. I didn't walk out of the Everglades the same person who went in. What happened during that final night still keeps me awake, and there are moments, quiet, dark moments, when I feel like I never really left." This is how it ended. The swamp was dead silent. I stood by the remnants of my camp, staring at the mangled mess of gear scattered across the ground. My tent had been shredded, the nylon torn apart as if by massive claws. My pack was overturned, supplies strewn everywhere, and muddy footprints circled the clearing, too large to belong to any human, and far too deliberate to be an animal. The smell was overwhelming now. That musky, putrid stench clung to the air, choking me with every breath. It was so strong I could taste it, and I knew with a cold certainty that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight and machete, the only tools I had left, and turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. The beam of light flickered, struggling to cut through the dense shadows. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. For a long moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the oppressive weight of the swamp pressing in around me. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, taller than any man and hunched low among the trees. Its eyes caught the light glowing faintly like two burning coals. It stood there, watching me, its massive frame blending seamlessly with the darkness. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature shifted its long, gangly arms, hinging at unnatural angles. It stepped forward, the sound of its movements heavy and deliberate, the mud sucking at its feet with every step. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I whispered, though I knew it wouldn't answer. It tilted its head, almost curious, and that's when I saw its mouth. Wide and toothy, its lips curled back in what could have been a grin or a warning. And then it lunged. I ran. My feet pounded through the swamp, the mud clinging to my boots and dragging me down with every step. The flashlight bobbed wildly in my hand, the beam slicing through the darkness but revealing nothing ahead of me. The thing was behind me, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. I could hear its guttural growls, low and primal, vibrating through the air. I stumbled over a root and went down hard, the flashlight flying from my hand and landing a few feet away. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to crawl toward the light, my breathing ragged and desperate. The growling stopped. For a moment, the swamp was silent again. I grabbed the flashlight, the beam flickering weakly, and turned it toward the trees. My hands shook as I scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. Then I heard a guttural breath just behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight catching the creature as it loomed over me. Its face was inches from mine, its glowing eyes boring into me with an intelligence that was almost human. I swung the machete blindly, the blade slicing through the air and hitting nothing. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural roar that shook me to my core. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I scrambled to my feet and ran, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle. The swamp seemed endless, a maze of twisted trees and dark water that offered no escape. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps, and my legs felt like they would give out any moment. And then, through the trees, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light reflecting off the surface of the water. My boat. I pushed myself harder, every step a battle against the mud and the ache in my body. The growling was closer now, the sound of branches snapping and heavy footsteps following me relentlessly. When I reached the boat, I didn't stop to think. I jumped in, nearly capsizing it as I yanked the rope free and fumbled for the motor. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull the cord, but after what felt like an eternity, the engine sputtered to life. The creature burst from the tree line, its massive form silhouetted against the faint moonlight. I slammed the throttle forward, the boat lurching into motion as the creature charged toward the water. It stopped at the edge, its glowing eyes locked on mine. For a moment, I thought it would follow me, but it didn't. It just stood there watching as the boat carried me away. By the time I reached the dock, the sun was rising. I stumbled onto the wooden planks, collapsing onto my knees as exhaustion and fear overtook me. The swamp was quiet again, the sounds of morning birds and insects returning as if nothing had happened. I tried to tell the others what I'd seen, but no one believed me. They laughed it off, saying the isolation must have gotten to me, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw. A few weeks later, while going through the trail camera footage, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, in one of the frames, was the creature. Its massive, shadowy form stood at the edge of the camera's view, its glowing eyes staring directly into the lens. I don't go into the Everglades anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I catch the faintest whiff of that musky, putrid smell, and in the darkest corners of my mind, I know it's still out there, watching, waiting.